Hello, Lynn Watts here with Wyatt the Wonder Dog. And today I want to talk about helping students learn how to make difficult decisions, or really any decision, but especially what to do when challenged with a decision that could be very difficult. So I have basically three concepts that I want to mention today. And then, of course, you would take these concepts and apply them in your individual counseling and also in your lessons that you teach. So, the first concept to help students with making any decision is to spend some time identifying who their role models are. And this would involve, of course, helping them understand what makes a good role model, what you might be looking for in a role model. And then anytime there's a decision to be made, ask yourself what would, and the name of the role model, what would they do? And so this gives them an opportunity to really take a look at the people who influence their lives. And so, of course, a role model might be a parent, it might be a teacher, it might be a coach, could be you as the counselor. But what would that role model do? And then once they identify someone that they would like to emulate, then to spend some time observing them and thinking about them in that way, noticing how they make decisions and what kind of choices that they make. So that's the first concept, is to identify role models and then spend some time really paying attention to how those role models behave and the decisions that they make. The next concept, and really the next two concepts, go hand in hand. So I'm going to sort of talk back and forth about them. But the first one is to identify values. So in a sense, this is also involved in identifying a role model. So helping students understand the importance of having some values in their lives and identifying specifically what those are, not just to talk in general about values, but to talk about things like being kind, being honest, having integrity, all these kind of words that many times we don't use a whole lot. And when we do, we just assume people know what that means. So talking about values and giving examples of that values. And of course, this is a great time to bring in stories and different picture books that illustrate those values. The third concept, which, as I mentioned, goes hand in hand with this, is to help students understand rules. And so I think it's important to identify rules early on. I know when I was working in a school, part of the standard procedure was to spend the first week really identifying structure. And part of that structure, of course, was rules. These are the rules that we have here at school, here in the classroom, individually, with peers and that sort of thing. So what are the rules? And then to tie those rules, not just to give a whole lot of list of rules. And of course, the more simple you can be about rules, the better. But this is why values is so important, because you can't really identify a rule for every situation, but you can identify a value for every situation. So when you talk about honesty, that's a value that can apply to any kind of situation. When you talk about kindness, that's a value that can apply to all relationships. So you don't have to have a specific rule for that particular, for every situation. Instead, you can always fall back on values. And that's why these two things, I think, go hand in hand. Especially with younger children, I think that it's very important to identify rules and for them to understand what the rules are. Part of understanding what the rule is becomes, and I say becomes because the younger the child, the less able they are to understand the concept behind it. But let's say a rule like not blurting out in class. In other words, raise your hand if you have something to say. That can be a rule in the classroom. What value does that relate to? Well, it relates to being respectful of others. It relates to being respectful of your teacher. And then what is respect? All right. So you can tie all of these things together, and it also helps in other situations. Because once you understand the concept of respect and why that's important, then you don't have to have a rule in mind for every time that you interact with someone. You simply know what the value is and how that is going to apply to any given situation. All right. So I think those are the three things that we really need to look hard at and spend time sharing with students. Number one is, who are your role models and why? And then to always ask yourself the question, what would they do in this situation where I'm having to make a decision? The second thing is to understand what your values are and to identify the ones that are top notch. What are the ones that are most important? And then the third one is to understand what are the rules in any given situation, whether that's at school, whether that's at home, whether that's perhaps on a sports team that you're on. What are the rules here? And then to understand how those rules should be a way of manifesting what the values are. So I think all of this goes together. And this is a great way to help students understand what they can rely on when faced with difficult decisions. So I hope that helps. Thanks for all that you do with young children. And as always, thanks so much for listening.